the climate talks in Paris wrapped up at the end of the last week, and there are a lot of postmortems going on, if that's the right word. It's probably not. Analyses, and now in many ways the hard work begins. So I wanted to talk to Rachel Cleetus, Dr. Rachel Cleetus, the lead economist and climate policy manager with the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, a great group that I've been following and whatnot since the 70s. UCSUSA.org is the website. Rachel, or Dr. Cleetus, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me, Tom.
Thanks for joining us. So, in layman's terms, what happened over the last 2 weeks?
Well, we had a really intensive series of negotiations with 196 countries, and we've reached a historic moment in time. We had agreement late on Saturday evening in Paris. I was there. I got back late last night, and we essentially have charted a new course for the world. Nearly all the nations of the world agreeing that we are now getting on a pathway to a low-carbon global economy. Our energy choices are going to lead us to solar, wind, renewable forms of energy, clean energy technologies, and innovation, and that there's a clear recognition that we are going to take on one of the greatest challenges of our time, climate change.
That all sounds great. How binding was the agreement that came out on on the countries in general and specifically in the United States?
This is a legally binding agreement. The United States is one of these nations around the world that has had signed on to the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The Paris Agreement itself is legally binding. It does not require Senate ratification, however, because the agreement itself contains no new financial or emissions reductions commitments within the agreement itself. At the same time, we also had a text on a number of COP decisions that were made in Paris. And what we have here is nations agreeing to a long-term goal, a climate goal that essentially sets us on a path to emissions neutrality in the second half of this century. And that means that we're going to be in a situation where we have to cut emissions deeply throughout the century to get on that pathway. The agreement is legally binding. It will not require Senate ratification because there are no new requirements on the U.S. in the Paris Agreement in terms of finance.
So how is life in the United States going to change as a consequence of this agreement?
Well, the interesting thing is, as far as our energy choices, life in the United States is already changing. We're in the midst of one of the biggest historic transitions in our power sector, for example, where in 2015 we had renewable energy additions to our electric grid that outpaced any other source of energy. So wind and solar outpacing any fossil fuel additions. We've seen wind and solar costs drop dramatically. Wind costs have fallen by more than half in the last 5 years. We've seen solar PV system costs drop by half just since 2010. So we're in a whole new era here, and what this agreement does is take that and accelerate it going forward. Now the whole world is going to be part of this clean energy transition.
Which is a fine thing. Yet here in the United States, we have state after state after state that has passed these what are called rescission laws, or preemption laws, rather, that are typically written or sponsored or promoted by the American Legislative Exchange Council, one of the Koch brothers' charities, that brings together Republican lawmakers and lobbyists to make it illegal in state after state, or very, very difficult, shall we say, for people to solarize their homes and keep their home connected to the grid and have their solar power interact with the grid power so they can feed the grid when they're producing surpluses and pull from the grid when they're not. Just as one small example, there's a huge battle about that going on in Hawaii right now and in Florida. I'm assuming this agreement isn't going to influence those kinds of U.S. laws.
This agreement is not going to influence U.S. laws, but what is going to influence facts on the ground in the U.S. is that we have a tremendous amount of energy and potential in the direction of renewable energy. these kinds of last-ditch efforts by the fossil fuel interests, they're going to continue for a little while, but it's clear that the tide has turned. When we were in the negotiations, AEP announced that it was leaving ALEC. And as an example, it said that it now saw the opportunities in the Clean Power Plan through its investments in renewable energy and transitioning away from fossil fuels like coal-fired power. So we are on the right side of history here. This global clean energy transition and the U.S. playing a lead role in it is where we're headed, despite the efforts of fossil fuel interests.
Yeah, was the issue of sudden climate change and the clathrate bomb, the possibility that methane in the Arctic and off the shores of the continental shelves might begin to melt and produce a rapid extinction scenario like it did in the PETM when it only took 13 years. Was any of that part of the conversation, or was this more just, about the dangers of more gradual warming, like, the sea level rise of 100 feet and wild weather events?
So the science of climate change was central to driving ambition in these negotiations, and that's why in the final agreement we have a goal of holding temperature increase to well below 2 degrees C and to pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We heard very powerfully from a number of nations around the world that are threatened by climate impacts, including the United States, where we've seen multi-year droughts, coastal flooding, an increase in extreme weather events. And so this was all very central to what pushed nations to come together and recognize that this is the moment we really have to take serious action.
What happened with the I'm sorry to be interrupting you, but we have just about a minute and a half left. What happened with the nations like India, for example, that are kind of late to the game in terms of the total amount of emissions they've produced, whereas we've produced massive amount of emissions over 150 years, and they're saying, give us some money to make this transition if you're going to force us to dial back on fossil fuels.
Yeah, we certainly heard some concerns from nations that there needs to be finance to help them get on this low carbon pathway as well as to cope with the impacts of climate change. India has made a very significant commitment of getting online 100 gigawatts of solar by 2022, but they need investments coming in to make this happen. And we do have in the agreement the beginnings of a foundation for that kind of finance, but this is one of the areas where going forward we are going to have to increase ambition. And the agreement is one of the central features of it is it recognizes that current commitments are not enough and that we need to come back and dial it up. So there's a 5-year cycle of coming back all the nations to increase ambition around both emission reductions as well as finance on the table.
Well, so you would disagree with James Hansen, who said he felt that this agreement was, his phrase, BS.
This agreement is not the final word, but it was a very important historic turning point in terms of global climate action. Okay,
good step in the right direction. Rachel Cleetus, Dr. Rachel Cleetus, lead economist and climate policy manager of the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, ucsusa.org. Dr. Cleetus, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Thom.
To watch more clips from our programs, hit the Watch More Videos button over here. And please be sure to hit the handy-dandy subscribe button so you'll always be up to date. Tag, you're it.